IVM.
Every other day when I have to explain India's nationalism to someone here in Beijing, I first have to explain that India was not a monolithic entity in 1947. No, as you may have possibly heard every single year in history class, what we now know as the modern states of India and Pakistan were in fact made up of 565 princely states. Imagine in 2019 having to consolidate 565 heads of state. Imagine having to convince all of them to sign over all of their powers to a new state whose shape no one knows. Imagine dealing with this against the backdrop of Imperial Britain, who wants to wash hands of the subcontinent as soon as possible. Imagine that all of this is happening against the backdrop of the greatest mass migration in human history, the partition. Now, all of us know about Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, the head of the States Department, who is quickly credited with unifying India. But there was another man by his side, someone who tempered out Sardar's open contempt for rulers. This was the man who was the original author of what became called the Mountbatten Plan. He was also the administrative head and secretary of the States Department. I am talking about VP Menon. Hello and welcome to States of Anarchy, a podcast on global affairs and foreign policy. I'm your host, Hamsini Hariharan. I like going back to India's history just because of the varied nature of interactions between India and the world before 1947. Today, we're going back to the origins of modern India. At the start of the episode, I'd mentioned VP Menon. Here's how Lord Mountbatten described him. Quote, "When I arrived in India in March 1947, I was indeed fortunate to find VP Menon as the Reforms Commissioner on the Governor-General's staff. I had never previously met him, but I found immediately that his encyclopedic knowledge of the Indian problem and his close contacts with the major Indian leaders, especially Sardar Patel, were invaluable to me. Indeed, it is fair to say that without the constant help and advice of VP Menon, the transfer of power as early as August 1947 would not have been possible. I wish, therefore, to say that I do not believe it is possible to overestimate how much we all owe to him for his service at that time. And I feel even now that there are many people in India who do not realize how much is owed to their great countryman, VP, as he is affectionately known to his many friends." End quote. We don't really know much about VP Menon. Frankly, I don't know why. Menon was unarguably the architect of the modern Indian state, and he deserves a lot of credit for the shape of the nation today. When we're talking about accession, it is not only a patriotic story from the freedom struggle. It's also about the tedium of paperwork, of drafting and redrafting, of negotiations and bargaining between bureaucracies. This may not seem like a typical foreign policy story to you, but for me, these stories are filled with themes of sovereignty and legitimacy and power. And my guest for today is someone who does the story justice. Narayani Basu is the great-granddaughter of VP Menon. She's a historian and a foreign policy analyst, and her biography of VP Menon will be published by Simon & Schuster in 2020. This will be her second book and the first ever biography on VP Menon. But before we get into the conversation with Narayani, let's take a short break to hear from IVM Podcasts.
Hey everybody, welcome to another awesome week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you are not following us on social media, please make sure you do. And it's about time that you did. So we're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Go to whichever platform you prefer or all three of them and click and follow. Also, you should check out our Instagram feed. We have a lot of interesting stuff going on over there. Peeks inside what's going on in the studio, polls, all kinds of cool stuff. So definitely come out there. Want to thank our sponsors this week, Cambly, Intel, and Storytel. Our sponsors make this stuff possible, and so please make sure that you shout out to them. Let them know that you appreciate it. One more note before we get into talking about what went on in the network this week, and that was that I would appreciate, deeply appreciate it, if you guys could go to ivmpodcast.com/survey or go to the website and click on the survey heading. And what we're going to do is we're going to do another listener survey. We'd like to know a little bit more about you, who's listening to us, why you're listening to us, what you want out of us, all of that kind of stuff. So, it would be really helpful to us if we could get a little bit of more information from you guys about who you are, and that would help us kind of go out and talk to advertisers, which is, again, as I mentioned earlier, how we get this thing going. So this week we're premiering a new Hindi storytelling show. It's called Tapri Tales and it's hosted by Madhuri Advani. Madhuri narrates day-to-day stories and occurrences in women's lives across generations. This week she questions the tea-serving traditions in our house through the mother and daughter pair in her story called Chai Ki Cha. On Cyrus Says, Cyrus is joined by senior journalist and author Veer Sanghvi. He talks to Cyrus about his new book, Game Changers, and discusses the prominent personalities that have impacted India. They also touch upon election results and what the future might hold. On Storytellers and Storysellers, Vineet is joined by journalist Banuj Kapal and co-founder of Gully Gang Entertainment, Chaitanya Kataria. Together, they talk about the hype around hip-hop in India and its cultural impact. On Filter Coffee, Karthik is joined by NBA commentator and author Akshay Manwani. In the episode, Akshay expresses his passion for classic Indian cinema, especially the works of Sahir Ludhianvi and Nasir Hussain, and discusses the evolution of the NBA in India. On Ganatantra, Dr. Ornit Shani joins Saryu and Alok to discuss the first electoral rolls, the entrenchment of democracy in India, and why, despite trying times, we must take heart. On the Empowering series, Zarina is joined by Dr. Mithika Kanabar. They discuss the relationship between stress and addiction. On Postcards from Nowhere, Utsav talks about his 6-month-long stay in Shanghai and how it changed his outlook towards Chinese tourists. On Agla Station Adulthood, Ayushi and Natasha test each other by asking 20 questions. And with that, let's get you on with your show.
Welcome back to States of Anarchy. I'm your host, Hamsini Hariharan, and I'm talking to Narayani Basu about her new book on her great-grandfather, VP Menon. Hi, Narayani. Welcome to States of Anarchy. I'm super happy that you're here.
I'm super excited to be here.
So you're VP Menon's great-granddaughter.
That is right.
So did you grow up hearing stories of him? I don't know. How was it growing up with his legacy?
To be honest, I did not grow up hearing stories about him. My family has been pretty pragmatic about the fact that he is my great-grandfather. And also, when you're a kid, I feel like you're not really interested in legacies that are too big for you to understand. You're not interested in legacies, period.
Yeah.
So, no, I did not have any idea about who he was or what role he had played in the history of this country at all. When I grew a little older, by the time I entered class 12, when I was heading towards college, I knew that I loved history. And I knew that I wanted to study history in college. And when I took history in college and modern Indian history, I began noticing his name in all the books that we had to read for exams, etc. But it was just his name. It was never anything further than VP Menon, brilliant Indian civil servant, VP Menon Reforms Commissioner. And I think that's the time when I actually asked about who he was. Because there was nothing further ever mentioned about him. And I have to confess that at that point, I did not read his books, Transferpa and the Integration of the States at all. I just wanted to know more about who he was. And it was only when I was about 19 or 20 that I heard my first stories about VP Menon.
From?
From my mum, who is his granddaughter. And they would be stories of when she remembered him when she was about 13 years old, 12 years old. So they were a child's memories. So again, nothing that was related to his professional aspect in life. But it made me curious, because here there was this juxtaposition at home about a man whom my mother referred to as Dada, and this name that I kept reading about. And the more I dug, and I kept digging as I grew older, I kept digging. It was sporadic digging, but it was digging. And I never found anything. There was no biography, there were no memoirs, there was nothing. There were just these two books, which is essentially a retelling of India's constitutional history. So it's essentially both books are extremely seminal, but they are textbooks. They're almost manuals of how India achieved constitutional reform and thereafter was integrated into the map we know of today. But there was nothing about who this man was or where he came from or anything like that. Was he fun? Was he, what sort of man was he?
What did he like? What did he dislike?
Yeah, there was nothing. And my mother and her brother remember a grandfather who was affectionate, who was very busy, but who was very affectionate, and who was sick most of the time, because this was in the 60s that they were growing up as kids, and he was already very sick. And he would die in 1966 anyway. And in about 6 years ago, I was working as a research analyst, and I drifted away from history. I had majored in international relations and Chinese foreign policy. But it kept gnawing at me, because there was just nothing on the man. And I had taken to reading non-fiction greatly, and I had taken to reading a lot of historical and political biographies. And you had biography after biography on Sardar Patel, on Jawaharlal Nehru, on men we know of as stalwarts of the Indian independence movement. We had nothing about the man who was supposed to have helped behind the scenes. He was supposed to have been Sardar Patel's right-hand man. And yet no one had given credence or cognizance to this fact. And it was about that, at that point 6 years ago, that I quit my job and I decided I wanted to focus full-time on writing a biography. And in the process of that, I've come to know of a great-grandfather who shaped not only the history of this country, but basically changed the map of South Asia that we know of today. So it's been a journey, I have to say.
Yeah, it sounds, I mean, sure, there's the professional aspect of you writing the book, but it also sounds like a deeply personal journey.
It has been in many ways a deeply personal journey. Even though I've grown up not really relating to being VP Menon's great-granddaughter, writing this book has led me to research in Kerala. It's led me to find family in Kerala that I didn't know existed. It's led me to reconnect with people that I had fallen out of touch with. It's led me to discover people I didn't know existed. Entire branches of the Menon clan, which had drifted apart over the years. And because of lack of telephone or email in those days, and because the older generation had died out, and the younger generation had in many cases migrated abroad. There's an entire clan that lives in America, for instance. It's been a journey in many different ways for me. And it's allowed me to connect with a part of my family that I didn't really pay attention to while I was growing up. So yes, it has been very personal.
That sounds beautiful. But I know you sit a lot at the archives, but how did you go about researching the book?
So when I first began researching the book, I was very much at sea because this is a first biography. It is also a first biography of the person in question. So there have been no secondary sources as such to fall back on. There has also been the slightly intimidating aspect of having to juxtapose him against huge figures: Jinnah, Gandhi, Patel, Nehru, Mountbatten, all Wavell, Linlithgow. How do you make someone who is essentially a bureaucrat significant when he was surrounded by men who were giants in their time, without minimizing these men?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds a little bit like, how you have a play with different characters, all great in their own light, but then suddenly you turn the spotlight from one of the main characters to someone who's always been sidelined.
Exactly.
It sounds a little bit like that.
It is actually very much like that, because when you, or at least when I was looking at this, I began to find that a lot of the grunt work is done by men in the shadows, like VP Menon, and his cronies, his peers in the civil services. And here I need to make it clear that he wasn't an ICS man himself.
Okay, so...
ICS being the Imperial Civil Service. He was never an ICS man. He was always an outsider. He joined government service completely by chance. He joined in 1914. The First World War had just broken out. A lot of the personnel in the British government had been drafted overseas for the war effort. And they were looking for temporary men. They were looking for people who could type. They were looking for peons. They were looking for, general dogs' bodies. And he applied. And he was drafted as a typist in the Home Department in 1914. And that is where he started. So he never sat for the ICS examinations. He never gave them. He was never a gazetted official. So he also had to deal with a lot of resentment as he moved his way up, because for somebody who never sat for or cleared the civil services to have attained the highest position and being an Indian at that, garnered him a lot of resentment as well. So I'm not saying his journey was easy, but I'm also not saying that it was completely blightingly difficult. Surprisingly, a lot of the help that he encountered on his professional journey came from the British, came from very helpful English superiors who allowed him to put forward ideas, put forward opinions. And it's largely because of that. So, yeah.
So, you had the archives to go back to, but
yes,
those are a beast in themselves.
They are. There's the National Archives in Delhi, which is it's a huge repository of all kinds of resources: Home Department, Political Department, States Ministry. There are his official papers, which are at Nehru Memorial. As his family, obviously, we have his personal papers. There are also papers at the British Library. There's also archives at SOAS in England. And there's also archives in Kerala. So it's been huge.
So you visited each of these places?
I visited each of these places.
I can see why it's taken you 6 years.
It's taken me 6 years. Well, it's also taken 6 years because, like I said, I didn't also know how to juxtapose him against these giants. The way has become clearer over the years. It tends to, because as you're going through archival material and you're focusing on just the one person, that person tends to stand out a little more and a little more until his role becomes more defined with every file you read. So it's become easier, but certainly when I started, it was hugely daunting.
All right. So I know a lot of people who are listening to this podcast have read of VP Menon in the 10th standard history books then forgotten about it forever. So can you tell us what VP Menon did?
VP Menon, to start at the very beginning, started out as a typist in the Home Department. He worked his way up to join the Reforms branch, which was essentially set up to look after the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms.
Okay.
And to see that they were implemented properly. So he joined there as a secretary. And he worked his way up, and he stayed with the Reforms branch throughout. There he stayed. And it was there that he began. I mean, he was encountering helpful superiors all across the board. But this particular boss that he had at the Reforms branch was somebody called Sir Hawthorne Lewis, who was his immediate superior. And Hawthorne Lewis basically took a shine to him. And he was taken abroad for the first time in his life to London for the Round Table Conference. And he worked his way up to become assistant to Hawthorne Lewis. And then he took over after Hawthorne Lewis stepped down. And then he moved his way up to becoming constitutional advisor. He was constitutional advisor to India's last 3 viceroys, to Linlithgow, to Wavell, and to Mountbatten. And thereafter, in that capacity, he helped with the transfer of power. He was extremely instrumental with the Cripps mission and the cabinet mission. He then, after the transfer of power was barely over, was drafted by Sardar Patel to join him at the States Ministry as secretary. And together with Sardar Patel, and here it's important to remember that Sardar Patel was fairly ill by 1949. And he left most of the grunt work of the integration of the states to VP Menon. He signed off, obviously, as minister on all major decisions. But the large task of negotiating with rulers, with princes, was left to VP Menon. So he is responsible largely for most of India's constitutional reform, her transfer of power, and her integration.
Wow, that's a long list of things to do.
Yeah, and he was also the typist who typed the Montagu-Chelmsford report.
So just very briefly, what did it entail to be constitutional advisor to the last 3 viceroys?
You had to basically look after the implementation of any reforms. You had to generally be the viceroy's right-hand man. So you were called in on major decisions that were required as far as movement towards the transfer of power was, in what it meant for the transfer of power. So he was basically consulted on all sorts of things. He was consulted by the food department. There was the famine in Bengal. In 1943, he was communicating a lot with the Bengal government about supplies of rice, about the status of the famine there. At the time of partition, he was one of the main men whom the head of the emergency committee that was set up, this man called H.M. Patel, was the head of that committee, and he consulted VP Menon on a lot of things. So he may not have been hugely involved in certain departments, but he was, let's say, the top person that you basically went to. So he was sort of your top boss type figure.
Now, I know that partition happens and VP Menon's role has largely been overshadowed, but I think that's a whole different podcast by itself. What I really wanted to talk to you about was about the States Ministry, just from a foreign policy, international relations point of view. Mm-hmm. It's very interesting for me to see how all of these different princely states signed away their sovereignty to be part of what they could then call a supranational organization, right? In a way, that's what we would call it now. But it's such an integral part of India's history. And I mean, this is something that I complain about generally when we talk about the history on the podcast, that we devote 3 lines of it on our NSERT textbooks, and that's about what anyone can remember about the States Commission. So tell me a little bit about the context in which the States Commission was set up. When was this happening?
This was actually happening right from 1935 onwards. So it was a long process. 1935 was when the Government of India Act was enacted following the roundtable conferences in London. And Linlithgow was viceroy at that point. And there was a general realization that when you took India's hand and basically led her towards freedom, it was not just British India you would be talking about. You would also be having to deal with the princes. And there were 565 princely states. And this is including tiny estates, taluks, feudatory states, the rulers of which like to call themselves rajas, but they weren't actually rajas. There were big, small dots on the map. You had to be dealing with them as well. What would independence mean for these people? What would it mean for an order that had kept itself alive essentially against the Mughals, the Marathas, the Sikhs? What would it mean for them? So this was a conversation that began in 35, was stymied by the outbreak of the war, started again in 43 when the war was reaching its crescendo, and then continued sporadically. So every mission that came here, the Cripps mission, the cabinet mission, talked about the princes, was incredibly vague about what independence would mean. Nobody really wanted to sit down and look at what that would mean for the princes until push finally came to shove, and it was suddenly 1947. And you had Clement Attlee declaring that, okay, fine, the empire is going to be handing India her freedom. And in 46, to job back a little, in 46, the writing on the wall was fairly clear. So they managed to, so Wavell was viceroy at that point. Mountbatten hadn't come in. Patel and Nehru were already talking to the princes informally.
All right.
And there was a general, and by princes I mean representatives from big states, Baroda, Travancore, Mysore, Hyderabad, Kashmir. They were already in informal conversation with Patel and Nehru, and their basic question was, look, what happens to us? And it's a known fact that Nehru and Patel were no great fans of the princes, because to both Nehru and Patel, the princes were representative of privilege, of pampered, spoiled brats.
Yeah, you hear all these stories of these princes with their riches. And
oh my God, yes.
They have these modern suits they drive the latest cars at that point in time and eat off gold or something.
They
right?
did. The Maharaja of Indore had a fleet of the latest cars of the time painted in vintage sunglow and black were his trademark colors. And he had monograms on the fenders of those cars. The state flag flew on the fenders of those cars. The indicator of one side when he was sitting in the car would be red, and when the Maharani was also in the car with him, it would be blue. So,
Wow.
yeah. So it was opulence at a whole other level. But these guys had survived so much. They were not really sure about what it meant, what the future meant, and they didn't like what they were seeing in provinces, neighboring provinces. You had independence movements breaking out. A lot of them were also afraid about if those independence movements overlapped into their states, what would their subjects feel? What would it mean for them? So it wasn't just the empire exiting, it was also the independence movement which was endangering their existence.
True. I mean, I think something that you mentioned in one of your chapters was also a lot of these princes trace their lineage all the way back to the Vedas, right?
Yeah.
So they have this claim over, our sovereignty comes from the fact that we're descended from the gods.
But you had
almost
to propagate that to have your house rule for so many centuries, right?
Yeah.
So how do you do away with that age-old sovereignty that you have? And at this point, by 46, 47, sovereignty for these guys was just becoming, it was a fig leaf at this point, because most of them knew what was coming, all of them didn't like it. Some of them, like the Nawab of Palanpur, which is, it's tiny, it's in Saurashtra.
Okay.
And it's the Nawab of that particular, it was an agency, it was not a state of its own, but it was an agency.
So what exactly is an agency?
An agency was essentially, you had smaller states which were essentially clubbed together into one superseding umbrella, which was known as an agency. So for instance, in central India, you had a lot of small states. Bundelkhand was comprised of tiny states, which were then clubbed together into what was called the Central India Agency.
Okay.
Its headquarters would be in a bigger state within that region. So the headquarters of the Central India Agency, to keep with that example, would be at Indore.
Okay, sure. Okay, so, and how the princes were opulent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How the princes were opulent and how basically they saw the writing on the wall. A lot of them didn't like it. And I was talking about the Nawab of Palanpur.
Yeah.
And the Nawab of Palanpur was essentially one of the very few princes who had seen the end coming as early as 1921.
Oh, wow. That's prescient.
Yeah. So he had seen the end coming because that's when your first steps after 1909, which is when the Molly Minto reforms were. With the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, he said, look, I think we need to adjust to the fact that sooner or later, democracy is going to come to our states. And this was a refrain he kept up from 1921 right till 1947. Nobody listened to him, but didn't stop him from saying it. So you had a minority of princes who felt, okay, fine, this is going to happen, we may as well accept the inevitable. You had some like Hyderabad and Travancore, which said, look, we don't care.
And they're large states, right?
Huge states, huge states, huge coffers. And naturally, they felt that...
Own armies also.
Own armies. Many of the big states had their own armies. And they felt, okay, fine, we can manage on our own. And even if the country is partitioned, which in 1946, remember, it wasn't a reality.
Yeah,
it wasn't the reality it would become. And they said, okay, fine, even if we take that contingency into account, we will not join either India or Pakistan. It's a different story, of course, that Travancore in 1947 would go on to set up his own, like a trade agent in Karachi. But in 1946, they were basically saying, look, we'll stay independent. We don't need to join anybody. And there were others who were just plain confused. So there was a whole wealth of feelings across the spectrum. And I know that the common belief is that Nehru and Patel were incredibly dismissive of the princes. But from what I've seen, that's not entirely the case. Yes, they did not like the princes. Yes, they were representative. The princes were representative of an order that had nothing to do with the democratic modern India. But in all Nehru's interactions with princes big and small, he was quite open about, you can come and talk to me anytime. If you have any questions, we can talk. He's gone on record to say, look, if the people of your state accept you as a ruler, I'm nobody to intercede.
But how much of that is just sort of political signaling, and how much of that do you think he meant? I mean, we can never know for sure, but
I don't think we can ever know for sure. But certainly the signals that he sent were not outrightly dismissive. Sure, there are stories behind the scenes as well, because every coin has two sides. So there are stories of, and this is a story by a civil servant called HVR Iyengar, who was working alongside Nehru, Patel, VP Menon. And Iyengar was present at a dinner party which the Maharaja of Jaipur had thrown, and Nehru was present. And it was an informal dinner party. There were not so many guests. There were 10 people present. And Nehru just basically ignored his host, who was the Maharaja of Jaipur. Nehru wanted nothing to do with the Maharaja of Jaipur. So there are two sides to every story. So, yes, from the official records that I have seen, certainly I can say that both Nehru and Patel kept up a fairly open channel of communication.
Fair enough. I think it's important to note that you have different histories of what happened, right? There are different narratives that exist. What you're doing, even with the biography of VP Menon, is to sort of look at, sure, there's this main story of, we all fought for independence and then we got it and everyone lived happily ever after. But these are the nitty-gritties of it. And I think the deeper you delve into them, the more alternative stories that you can see of how things could have been as well.
Because I think that's very true. I think that there are different narratives, and for a biography like this, because of who VP Menon was, which is essentially a bureaucrat, I have looked at narratives of bureaucrats working behind the scenes, working with him at that point, from 1947 onwards to 1950. I have looked at narratives of people whose stories aren't really taken into account when you're talking of an event as momentous as this. And everybody has their own stories. Everybody has their own take on events that have happened, which I think is important when you're contributing, when you are talking about somebody who's worked behind the scenes. You need to take into account people who worked alongside him, because it's easy to get swept away by tales of patriotism and, stirring speeches, and, all of that it's makes for a great flowing story. But there were people behind the scenes who had to undergo tedium. I mean, let's be honest, transfer of power was not just soul stirring. It was also a lot of paperwork. It was also endless drafting and redrafting of clauses, of sentences, of phrases that could go against the interests of the country. That doesn't make for the sensational reading, but that's essentially how this country was crafted. That's how the states were integrated. You had clauses, you had to sit up all night reading and rereading. And in fact, partition itself, apart from the horrific demographic fallout, apart from the lives that were lost, it came down to something as petty as how many pencils were going to Karachi and how many pencils were going to be staying in Delhi.
Yeah, I remember reading about how they had to apportion the furniture that was in all police stations and all government offices.
Yeah.
And then Pakistan complained that they were sending all the broken furniture that was in India. And it just comes down to very petty things, right?
It was as inane as that. There was a point where they were looking at dividing the printing presses run by the government of India. And there were 6 printing presses. And obviously, Mountbatten suggested 3 go to Karachi, 3 stay here. Sardar Patel said no. Nobody asked them to carve themselves off. We'll keep all 6. Now, when you're arguing over something as stupid as printing presses, it tends to show you a whole different side of process that can easily be taken as this amazing movement and this amazing flow of events. But it also had a very petty side to it.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like the freedom struggle can never be taken lightly. I mean, the reason we're able to sit in this room and have this conversation is because it rests on the shoulders of men and women who fought really hard for it.
Absolutely.
But I think also the histories that we learn are simple like montage shots with nice patriotic music playing in the background. And the things that we're talking about now, the tedium of it never really comes under the spotlight.
Yeah.
So going back to the States Commission, so there were these 565 princely states, and Patel and VP Menon were tasked with getting them all to accede to India. Is that what their objective was?
That essentially was the objective. The initial clause was, okay, fine, if you want to stay independent, you can. And since we're talking about an IR foreign policy perspective, I'm putting it like this because people in the States Ministry then had a different idea, because you couldn't have little islands of territory in the heart of the country that said, okay, we're independent now. Because what does that mean for foreign policy? What does that mean for trade? So people in the States Ministry were thinking along very different lines. Rulers of states were thinking along different lines. People in the states were thinking along different lines. So you had three different thought processes continuing in a sort of a parallel stream. Because, for instance, take the case of Hyderabad. Huge state, heart of India. How do you leave it independent, right?
Or let it align with
Pakistan. Or let it
align
with Pakistan.
In the eyes of the statements.
Let it align with Pakistan. How do you do that? How do you do it even for tiny states? Supposing it's a dot on the map. And this was an eventuality that Indian bureaucrats had been warning Whitehall of for some time. When the documents regarding the transfer of power were being drafted, you had Sir B.N. Rao, who was a contemporary of VP Menon. And he was also a constitutional advisor. And he basically warned Mountbatten that you have essentially 327 tiny dots on the map. These guys are going to give you the bigger headache, because when transfer of power was going to take place, there was essentially a condition that paramountcy would lapse, which meant that the crown was the paramount power. Once the crown's relations with the states lapsed, that left the state independent. So if you have a speck of territory and you suddenly give it complete and utter independence, what happens? I mean, what do you do with a state whose annual income is less than 10,000 rupees a year? And I'm talking about figures in those days.
Yeah.
How do those states handle it? What happens? And these could be states in the heart of big states, which are already acceding to India. What happens then? And as it happened, Whitehall ignored those warnings. And in the end, those were the states that created a lot of problem.
So before this podcast started, we were talking about the 4 levels of sovereignty, in a sense, right? Could you just tell me what those are?
Essentially speaking, from what I've seen, you had people in the States Ministry. So you had VP and Sardar Patel thinking along very different lines. You had them looking at India as a cohesive unit. They didn't want any independent states anywhere in the map that they were envisaging, because they were, for one, post transfer of power, you had partition. I don't think either VP Menon or Sardar Patel actually envisaged the level of carnage that would take place. So you had the country in complete uproar. Did they want states that were independent and going to go about demanding things from other countries on their own? In the middle of all of this, they didn't exactly want an international crisis also. So they were thinking along those lines. So they were thinking along the lines of national sovereignty. What do we do about keeping this country together? What do we do about keeping this country stable? The rulers of X state or Y state had completely different notions, because, like you said, these were rulers who were dating their rule back to Vedic eras, or some of them said they were descended from the sun and the moon. So you had age-old histories of sovereignty which had sort of become entrenched almost. They were embedded in your lifeblood almost. And that was a very insular idea of sovereignty, because it was basically just limited to the territory of your state and your throne and your crown. That was it. Your line of succession, your heirs, that was your idea of sovereignty. their subjects had completely different ideas of sovereignty. And by that I mean those ideas of sovereignty were fairly nascent. They had not yet evolved into a guided idea of what they wanted their state to be. They could see examples across the country of integration, of accession. By and large, I think the people of various states actually came around to the idea of integration only much later, by 48, 49. Until then, there was a very sort of a ambivalent idea of nationalism, because these were people who had been used to the rule of a particular ruler for so many years, that suddenly the idea of that carefully constructed notion falling apart meant the opening up of endless possibilities.
It's literally stripping away a part of your own identity in that sense, right?
So you are essentially reshaping your own identity. What did that mean for you? So these are also questions that I think would make for interesting study further, because honestly, I think that's not something we've looked at too far. I think that when you're discussing the integration of states, it's easy to talk about the appropriation of territories, but you're also looking at people's identities. So when you're looking at it from a more sociological point of view, it would make for quite a fascinating study, because not much work has been done on that, I think.
We'll save that for your next book. So how did VP and Patel go about convincing the princes or coercing them into signing?
Well, there have been lots of charges that have been levied against them about blackmail, about coercion, or the implied threat of coercion. I think that is unfair, because I think in the aftermath of the transfer of power, like I said, I don't think either of them envisaged the fallout, the scale and scope of the fallout. And I think at some point it just became about keeping the country together. I think before the transfer of power, you had them realizing that in order to make this country a functional democracy, you had to get the princes on board. So before the transfer of power, there was a marked difference. You had regular meetings with major rulers, Baroda, Bikaner. Again, Travancore, Hyderabad refused to accede or even listen to the possibility. Hyderabad maintained its defiance and continued to stand apart. Travancore, VP managed to convince, because essentially these states either brought in their own rulers who attended talks with Patel and Menon, or they sent in their prime ministers, who were also known as Diwans. Most of these states had rather clever Diwans who wanted to preserve state independence. So essentially, before the transfer of power, you had this good long series of talks which just went on and on for a couple of days at a time, started in the morning, ended late at night. And there were incredibly technical questions asked about, what the transfer of power meant, what the lapse of paramountcy meant, where exactly they would stand, stuff like that. Questions were asked. Sardar Patel was silent most of the time. When he did speak, some of his comments can easily be perceived as veiled warnings, because he did say things like, if events force our hand, we might have to take over state interests. This wasn't geared to comfort any of the princes who were listening. He never elaborated, but by this point, I think everybody knew the measure of Sardar Patel, and they knew that if he would assume charge of the States Ministry, which he officially did only in July 1947, that he would not be neutral, and that he definitely had an agenda. But he was a naturally reticent man, never really spelled out that agenda. But were there warnings leading up to the transfer of power? Yes, there were. There were veiled warnings, definitely. Mostly civilized talks, mostly, conferences, back and forths about what transfer of power would mean. It was only after the transfer of power that VP and Sardar began thinking along very strategic lines. And like I said, it was basically about keeping the country together. They didn't want the international prestige of India to fall. A newly independent nation fought so long to free itself from colonial shackles. They felt that if they did not do something to preserve that stability, that would be a blow. And India was just about standing on her own feet. It would not be helpful. So most decisions were driven by that. Even if you read his official narrative of that, of the integration of the states, that is what he puts down as his driving objective: to maintain communal harmony, number one, and to maintain India's prestige as a newly independent nation.
When I was reading through your chapters on the States Commission, I think one thing struck me was, just again in IR terms, is that the princely states could, if you look at them through sort of the lens of game theory, they make for a very interesting reading. Because as you said, there was a whole spectrum of opinions on the board about what they should do. Should they merge with the Union? Should they fight for independence? Should they sort of leverage Pakistan or try to appeal to Britain or Mountbatten? Because several of them did have close relations with Mountbatten. And it always, this is a counterfactual, and therefore it won't really take our analysis any further. But it's always interesting of thinking, what would VP and Sardar done if all 546 of them had banded together and said, no, we're not signing an instrument of accession. Just for me, that's a very interesting take. What do you think?
That is interesting, but I think most princes knew that that wasn't an option. Because if you look at the chronology of events, immediately after the transfer of power, you had Junagadh and Hyderabad going into action. You had events in Kashmir building towards a crescendo. Junagadh and Hyderabad were the driving factors for most states to sit up and say, okay, these guys mean business. From there, it was easy enough to convince, again, I'm not using the word coerce here, I'm saying convince them to come on board. Because while Junagadh and Hyderabad were going on, VP was also attending to states like Odisha, Chhattisgarh, in Gujarat. He was attending to states like these. It was in fact in states like Odisha, and Odisha, it must be remembered, was a province in itself. It just had some feudatory states within that province which were independent. So basically his main objective was, okay, we need to merge these guys with the main province of Odisha. And one of his driving factors for this was again Hyderabad. And Hyderabad, in fact, loomed very large over a lot of the initial efforts towards integration, because Hyderabad posed such a great strategic threat to India's national security at that point. And there were a lot of states that were more or less contiguous with Hyderabad. So they didn't want Hyderabad to also make inroads into Orissa. So immediately they started looking at Orissa. So internal security, international prestige, these were things that were important at that point.
Yeah, I remember at some point Jinnah put forward a proposal for an East Pakistan or West Pakistan and sort of a road that would connect them. A corridor that would connect them through India. And I could see why this sort of idea would be fundamentally scary to people in the States Commission.
It was immensely scary. It was laughed off. Patel dismissed it as ridiculous. So did Nehru. But the fact was that East Pakistan did exist. So, you had refugees coming in from there. They were passing through states like Assam, like Cooch Behar, which is, again, Cooch Behar, tiny, speck on the map. Extremely proud royal heritage. Had defended in the past, successfully defended itself against Bhutan, against inroads from Tibet, inroads from the Ahoms, against the Mughals. So, immensely proud royal heritage. Tiny geographically, really speck on the map. Strategically really important because it was bordering Manipur, it was bordering West Bengal, Assam. It was party to an influx of refugees coming in. So it was important. So you had considerations like that as well. So it was not just West Pakistan that was creating a danger, it was also East Pakistan. So basically, it was a difficult situation at that point.
Yeah, and when we say, we say convince very easily, but there's this process of sitting down, sending them a draft of the accession, I'm sure there would have been a lot of back and forth, a lot of questions, a lot of comments, a lot of disagreements about
a lot of disagreement. In Orissa, for instance, when VP went to Orissa, there were different categories of feudatory states. There were the bigger states, so Class A, slightly smaller, Group B, and the specs, Group C. The specs said, okay, fine, we'll accede. It was the Groups A and B that were difficult. So there was a lot of negotiation, and that was primarily led by VP at that point. Sardar Patel did accompany him to Orissa. There was a meeting in Cuttack. VP handled the negotiations of these rulers himself, because Sardar Patel by this point was losing his patience, because these guys were saying, no, we need some more time. This was already 1948, by the way.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So they said, no, we need some more time to think about it. And, we'll get back to you, essentially. And this was the wrong thing to say to Sardar Patel, because they were leaving he and Menon were leaving for Nagpur in the next day, practically.
Okay. Yeah.
So you had less than 24 hours to convince some 24 states to sign the instrument of accession. So essentially, that meeting lasted that whole day well into 7 a.m. the next morning with VP and these rulers. And essentially, he had to send the Maharaja of Dhenkanal, which is a small state in Orissa. And the Maharaja was not a very popular man. He had already been kicked out of his state once by his subjects. VP Menon said, look, if you can get these guys on board, the rest of them on board, I will make sure that I install you as ruler. I'll give you a good privy purse, and you won't have any trouble. So you speak to them, because they're not listening to me. And then Dhenkanal did. And he managed to convince the rest of them to say, look, this is in your best interests if you sign. Matters did not end there. You had the Maharaja of Patna then, who came in and said, look, you have to give it to us in writing. That if we agree, we are doing this under pressure. And if we did not agree, you would have taken over our states. You have to put that in writing. So he said, fine, I'll put it in writing. And he did. He put it in writing.
Yeah.
He put it in writing. He said, in the interests of India's security, we would have had to take over the administration of your states. And the minute it's a tiny piece of paper, barely about 5 lines. And then he laid down the pen and he said, okay, now you sign. It's your turn. And then they went through the instrument of accession clause by clause, worked through the night. And he managed to get all of them on board by 7 a.m. the next morning. And he had to go straight to the railway station because Sardar Patel was already sitting in the train. He was waiting for him because he knew that if VP Menon hadn't showed up, that something was going on.
Just because you brought this up in terms of timelines,
can
you tell us why they don't have a lot of time? You know that this process started a little earlier than independence.
Yeah.
And through partition, you could see the bloodshed on both sides. But why was time of the essence? Why couldn't they have gone a little slowly, managed to convince these people nicely?
Like I said, it all comes back to internal security, communal harmony, international prestige.
Okay.
Because, like I said, initially you had states being given the option, okay, look, you don't have to join either India or Pakistan, you can stay independent. Post transfer of power with partition, with everything that was happening, with the bloodshed, with the refugees, with the violence, most of these states had to be taken over. In Orissa, like I said, the major threat was Hyderabad. In states like Alwar and Bharatpur, there was immense communal violence.
Where is
Alwar is in Rajasthan. Bharatpur is a UP side. And you had immense communal violence going on there, instigated primarily by the Prime Minister of those two states. You had entire Muslim communities being butchered. And this was something that had started as early as June 1947, the communal violence there.
And this would spill over, obviously.
This would obviously spill over. And it did spill over. So you had maintenance of communal harmony being the driving force there. That in the name of national security, we need to take over these states right now. This is not going to work. In other states, in states like Manipur, you had an extremely lazy Maharaja who really didn't care about what was happening in his state. You had, by the time of transfer of power, his state was undergoing ructions in terms of domestic politics. The Manipur State Congress had formed at that point. And the State Congress in Manipur was basically saying, look, we need the throne to go. We need this ruler out. And it would be in Manipur's best interest if it merged and integrated itself with India. You had several other small parties which were also jockeying for political influence. They had formed a coalition. At the time of transfer of power, there was an election in Manipur. They had formed a coalition government.
Okay.
Completely useless government. Did nothing at all. Maharaja couldn't have cared less. By 1949, it was clear to VP that Manipur would have to be merged because there was just too much disarray in domestic politics. The Maharaja was useless. He was not doing anything to help the state along. And mostly the northeast states were generally left till the very end because Sardar Patel was more concerned with what was happening in the immediate vicinity, Kashmir, stuff like that. But by 1949, it was absolutely clear that they would need to take over Manipur. And so they did. So you had primarily the same reasons for taking over states across India post the transfer of power.
Okay. One of my favorite stories about this is when VP found himself staring into a revolver of a gun.
Jodhpur.
Yeah.
Yeah. He was immensely excitable, extremely hot-headed. He had initially been very tempted to join Pakistan. And Jinnah had, and this is an account that the Maharaja of Jodhpur had told a contemporary of his, who was a minor Raja from a place in Bundelkhand called Sarela. So the Maharaja of Jodhpur's version of this was that essentially Jinnah had given him a blank piece of paper with his signature on it and said, name your terms and conditions, it's yours. This version had a meeting being arranged between Jodhpur, Jaisalmer and Jinnah.
Okay.
In Delhi. And where Jinnah basically promised Jodhpur that, look, if you join with Pakistan, we'll give you border districts with entire Rajput populations from Pakistan's Sindh province. We'll give you access to the port in Karachi, and you'll be completely independent. Okay, all you have to do is to join.
That sounds like a lot. I mean, I'm not sure if they would have ever done it, but okay. Promises are promises.
Promises are promises. Well, I don't think it would have happened, but, a carrot is a carrot.
Yeah.
So, Jaisalmer basically intervened at this point and said, look, to Jodhpur, he said, look, I don't think we should do anything until we speak to your mother. And if your mother's okay with it, then all right, we can maybe think about this. And as soon as Jaisalmer said that, Jinnah took away the piece of paper. And he said, get back to me only when the Maharani signs off on this. Jodhpur's mother, not surprisingly, said, there is no way I'm going to countenance this. So that went out of the window. This story, in my opinion, is not true.
Okay.
Right? Because there are several versions of this. There's another version which has been left by the Nawab of Bhopal.
Okay.
The Nawab of Bhopal was notoriously against the idea of accession. He wanted nothing to do with accession. And he essentially also went to see Jodhpur. In this version, also there was another meeting with Jinnah. And again, Jinnah said, okay, we'll give you treaty relations, etc., etc. So essentially, there were large promises that were made to Jodhpur. VP Menon, however, has corroborated the fact that the Dowager Maharani of Jodhpur did not want to accede to Pakistan and had told her son, look, no way is this happening. So that part of the story at least was true. By the time Jodhpur came back, he didn't know what to do because not only was his mother against the idea of accession, but his people and his nobles weren't very pleasantly for the idea either. So he didn't know what to do. So he was here in Delhi. He was in fact at the Imperial Hotel.
Okay.
And he was alone in his suite. And VP got wind of the fact that he was alone. And he had a little window of time in which to get the Maharaja on his own and basically tell him, "Ki look, as a Hindu ruler of a Hindu state, it makes more sense if you accede to us."
Yeah.
So he went to the Imperial, found the Maharaja alone there, said, "Look, why don't you come with me back to Viceroy's house, meet Mountbatten, and let us talk to you about this." Jodhpur agreed. Mountbatten, however, was not quite as charming as VP had been.
Okay.
He said, "Look, it makes no sense, right? And it's a mistake. If you go ahead with this, there's going to be definite communal problems in your state." At this point, VP also added to this and said, "Look, he's right. If you do sign, I can tell you that none of Jinnah's promises will be kept. If you want to sign and agree to false promises, do go ahead. But I'm warning you, it's not going to work." So he said to the Maharaja of Jodhpur, VP Menon said, essentially, "You know that you're trapped. Your people aren't going to agree. Your mother's not agreeing. Your nobles aren't agreeing. So what are you throwing this tantrum for?" And by this time, the Maharaja was in a rage. So essentially, he was throwing a tantrum because he'd been thwarted. But he said, "Okay, fine. I can maybe look at it, the agreement, if you want me to look at it." So he was finally persuaded to sign. At this point, Mountbatten thought it was in the bag. He went out of the room. And VP turns around, finds himself looking down a revolver. The Maharaja is in a rage. And the Maharaja is yelling, saying, "I refuse to accept your dictation to me." And how VP managed to even keep his head is still a marvel to me. But he essentially told the Maharaja to stop behaving like a child. And he said, "If you think by threatening me, your accession is going to be abrogated, you've got another thing coming." That tantrum blew over. And as it turned out, VP and the Maharaja went on to become really good friends. In 1952, the Maharaja, in fact, became a great campaigner for democracy. Stood for elections even.
Won them?
Yeah.
Okay. Did he hold people at gunpoint for them?
No. He, in fact, sent VP a message in 1952, in which he said, "I'd like you to stand from my constituency as a Lok Sabha seat."
Oh, wow. What did VP say?
No.
Smart choice on VP's part. So, how long did this wrangling on behalf of the States Ministry go on for?
Till 1951.
That's what, 5 years? And
all told, yeah.
Of a lot of travel, of a lot of work.
A lot of crisscrossing of the country, practically.
And as you'd mentioned, Patel was already sick by then, so VP was taking a fair share of the responsibility.
VP actually began taking a fair share of the responsibility post-transfer of power because Sardar Patel was also very heavily involved with the fallout of partition. He was also heavily involved in keeping communal peace, in keeping in intelligence. He was involved in things that were very vital. And he couldn't obviously be everywhere at once. So it was a sort of an unspoken carte blanche that was given to VP. He was allowed free run of the States Ministry. Major decisions would obviously have to be run by Sardar Patel. In fact, there were telephone calls between him and Sardar Patel twice a day, once in the morning and once every evening. Usually those calls would come in while VP was having his dinner, which upset his wife because VP would abandon his dinner and get up and just be on the phone for hours at a time.
And South Indians have a thing for eat food hot or don't eat it all.
Yes, absolutely. So that was happening. So Sardar Patel was very much in the loop, but the primary person who was undertaking the negotiations, the drafting, the haggling with various rulers was VP Menon.
And it's such a pity that he's sort of left in the shadow of history in that sense.
Well, I'm hoping this book will do a lot to bring him into the limelight a little bit, because I do feel that bureaucrats tend to have this sort of reputation of a babu pushing paper. But frankly speaking, if there weren't babus pushing paper, nothing would get done. And, you know, you don't really read about the flip side of a transfer power, like I said. You don't really read about somebody who's making clauses and drafting agreements, because that's not exciting. You know, a tale of independence is usually associated with bloodshed and patriotism, and, you know, it's this whole movie reel in your head of stirring people and speeches, and, you know, it's not certainly associated with somebody putting stamps on paper and typing documents. But a bureaucrat's life is actually as exciting.
Yeah, I think the struggle is also in the mundane. The struggle is
in the everyday.
Yeah, in the everyday.
Yeah.
Okay, Narayani, this is my last question for you. What books would you recommend to people who want to read more about VP Menon? I mean, yes, I know your biography is going to be the authoritative source on him, I'm sure. But
I hope so.
What else do you refer to? What else do you think is a good starting point for other people too?
Well, I started reading around VP Menon at that point. So with every year that I was writing, I was sort of reading books that dealt with that particular year or that particular period in time. But some books that really helped me are Patrick French.
Okay.
Patrick French's Liberty or Death. I read a lot of first-person accounts as well. So a lot of first-person memoirs that were left behind. So, for instance, I read Kenneth Fights. He was a political agent in Bundelkhand.
Okay.
And he left behind an account of his time as political agent to the Raja, which is called Twilight of the Maharajas. Okay. I have read everything by Rajmohan Gandhi, because he's written so prolifically on men of the period as well as regions. He's written about Punjab, for instance. I read H.V. Hodson, who was a very, very good friend of VP Menon's and a reforms commissioner himself, albeit for a short period of time. He published a book called The Great Divide. He's also left behind some unpublished memoirs, which I've read. I have read Srinath Raghavan's War and Peace in South Asia. I have read, I mean, the list is huge. Conrad Corfield was political advisor and head of the political department here. He's left behind memoirs, which was called The Princely India I Knew. Piers, Brendon has written The Decline and Fall of the British Empire, which is a really witty, irreverent take on the British Empire. James Cameron was a journalist here who was covering the cabinet mission.
Okay.
He's left behind memoirs. So I've essentially depended a lot on memoirs of people who were here. And this is apart from, obviously, archival sources. But essentially speaking, to read about somebody who has never A, been written about, and B, that there's such a dearth of material on, I found it easier, and this is said very ironically, to sort of piece together a narrative from books that were written around him, because most first-person narratives of people who worked and lived alongside him did mention him because he was fairly popular. So you do have a lot of accounts of him left behind in people's oral histories, in people's memoirs. So I managed to piece it together from there as well.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Narayani. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
That's it for this episode of States of Anarchy. Thank you for staying with us. If you want to read more about VP Menon, then I've attached some links in the episode description. If you want to delve deeper into some of the topics that we discuss on States of Anarchy, whether it's public policy or foreign policy, I suggest that you check out some of the policy courses at the Takshashila Institution. If you have any comments or questions, you can reach out to me at Hamsini H on Twitter and at States of Anarchy on Instagram. You can listen to States of Anarchy, not only on the IVM podcast app and website, but also on iTunes, Spotify, Gaana, Castbox, or wherever you get your podcasts from. We'll be back next Tuesday.
Hi, I'm Sariyu Natarajan.
And I'm Alok Prasanna Kumar.
And we are the hosts of the Ganatantra podcast.
On this podcast, we speak to academics, social scientists, journalists and activists to find out what's actually going on in Indian politics.
On this podcast, we stay away from personality politics, intrigue and gossip, and instead focus on the data, research and analysis that drives all this.
So tune in to the Ganatantra podcast, where new episodes are out every Wednesday on the IVM podcast app, website, or wherever you listen to your podcasts.
How aware do you think you are of your laws and rights? Do you look up to laws when you are caught up in situations? Do you know what your rights are when you're stuck somewhere bad? Well, here's a show that can help you move an inch closer to being aware of what your rights are. Tune in to Know Your Qanoon with me, Amber Rana. This is a podcast meant to answer all your law-related queries. Catch Know Your Qanoon every week on the IVM website or the app or anywhere you get your podcast from.